Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're here to talk about what's happening at the federal level, which everybody's really excited about. So I'm Margaret Donahoe. I'm the director of the Minnesota Transportation Alliance, and we're really pleased to have with us a couple of experts who are going to fill us in on what's happening in Washington and what's happening with federal funding for transportation. I wanted to start out first by thanking our event sponsors who really help us put on these kinds of events throughout the year. So as you can see, we have 3M and Alliance, Bolton and Menk, HDR, SRF, Stantec, Stonebrook Engineering, TKDA, WSB, WSP, and WIDSEF. And then we also have our silver level sponsors, so we also want to thank them very much for their support. And I wanted to start out by just giving everybody a sense of what the landscape is to kind of help put some of these numbers into context. So I know a lot of numbers get thrown around. So what this shows is comparing 5-year proposals and starting over here with the FAST Act, which is where we are right now. This darker blue is the money for roads and bridges. The lighter blue is the funding for transit. So you can see we're at 260 billion over 5 years for roads and close to 70 billion over 5 years for transit. Now in 2019, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, that was when the Republicans had the majority, passed the American Transportation Infrastructure Act out of committee. And because they only have jurisdiction over the highway title, that's the only number you see. It was pretty robust compared to the FAST Act increase. And then in 2020, the House, under Chairman DeFazio, passed the House Moving Forward bill. And you can see the increase in funding for roads and bridges and the pretty significant increase in funding for transit. Now the President Biden has proposed the American Jobs Plan. And when you look at the funding specifically for roads and bridges, it's a very big increase. It's 115 billion on top of the current funding. And that part gets a little confusing because when you see numbers related to the American Jobs Plan, we all have to remember that that's on top of current funding levels. And then the Senate Republicans came up with sort of a counteroffer because they were not very excited about the American Jobs Plan. And you can see their funding for roads and bridges at about $299 is pretty similar to what the Senate EPW committee had passed. And then the transit funding is actually a reduction from the FAST Act. And their justification for that is because of the transit funding that was included in the last 3 COVID-19 relief packages. So just to give you, again, kind of a sense of the proposals that are out there before we jump into this conversation. So again, I want to really encourage everybody, please put questions in the chat box. This is your opportunity to get all your burning questions answered about federal transportation funding. And we can take questions kind of throughout the conversation today. So please feel free to do that. And I am going to turn it over to our speakers. I'll introduce both of them, and then they can just kind of take it away. So first of all, we're really pleased to have with us Joung Lee, who's the Associate Director for Finance and Business Development at AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. In that role, he reviews surface transportation policy and legislative matters with state transportation departments, congressional staff, and the executive branch. He also serves as Deputy Director of the AASHTO Center for Excellence in Project Finance, which provides education and research on transportation finance to states, which we always appreciate. And then we also have with us Serge Phillips, who many of you know, is the Federal Relations Manager at MnDOT. He works with our congressional delegation and advises the Commissioner on federal funding, policy, and federal legislation. So again, thank you to both of you for being with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joung to get started on his presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret, for having me speak to the Minnesota Transportation Alliance. It's always a great pleasure to speak to this group. And you guys play such a key role in, I think, helping to inform the national conversation, and certainly one of the, most vibrant and, influential state groups out there for sure. It's also really great to see Serge Phillips join this discussion as well. Serge is a longtime veteran of AASHTO and plays a key leadership role, serving on the steering committee of our Transportation Policy Forum at AASHTO, which is our main policymaking body representing the Midwestern states. So what I'll do is I'll go through a brief PowerPoint presentation just to kind of give you a sense of where AASHTO stands relative to the great context setting, kind of the numbers that Margaret displayed in terms of the various congressional proposals out there, and then give maybe some of the color commentary on what's going on after the PowerPoint. And I really aim to keep all of that very brief because I'd love for this to be a dialogue and hear, what your questions and thoughts are from the Minnesota perspective. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and hopefully this will pop up, and there it is. Great. So, we're looking at the infrastructure conversation as something that, yes, it's traditionally been talked about in terms of jobs created, but it goes well beyond that short-term benefits. And this is really, preaching to the choir, whether it's access to opportunities, improved quality of life, or economic benefits. Those are all multi-decade return when we take a big step on infrastructure investment. And, the state DOTs have really been appreciative of the $10 billion in COVID relief as part of the December 2020 package, because it really helped to bring the baseline of the individual state DOT programs to be able to then pivot, quickly to a robust reauthorization bill. But what we've also made it very clear in our communication to Congress is that the COVID relief really was a revenue backstop that brought programs back to the baseline, not an additive on top of the baseline that we envisioned the infrastructure package as a true fiscal stimulus, which would spur, additional investment above the baseline in terms of jobs and economic activities. And our policy recommendation on the infrastructure package, should it be done in kind of one-time boost manner that's been talked about in the context of the American Jobs Plan, is to put the money through the formula program, because that's really the best way to make sure the dollars flow to every part of the country, every part of the state. Very efficient, already responds to the existing tip and stip and long range plans in every state and metropolitan area. And then looking at the ERA experience, where it came with a 1-year obligation timeline that kind of forced the dollars to go to the quick hit projects, we feel that this is an opportunity to not only do those, but look at the more substantial improvement that admittedly will take longer to take place, but that can really provide that, transformational improvement in the long run as well. And to also put that money at 100% federal share, like it was with the COVID relief. Obviously, that's a faster way to get the dollars out. And, we still look at the 5-year reauthorization of surface programs as our North Star, in that has to take place by October 1 of this year, whatever happens with the infrastructure package, and that it should really, look to address the long-term revenue challenge or find the solution to the revenue challenge in the Highway Trust Fund, continue to really increase and prioritize a formula-based funding, as I mentioned, for the reasons on the infra package, absolutely applicable on the reauthorization side, as well as really we're looking at 92% of the highway dollars going out to formula and the FAST Act, and would love to maintain that in the future. Looking to increase flexibility, reduce program burdens, and look for ways to make sure that we can get the projects delivered more quickly, while obviously, making sure that the environmental safeguards and community considerations are fully taken into account and mitigated or improved ideally. And then looking at ways to support and ensure state DOTs to really harness innovation and technology as well. We are having a very robust conversation amongst the state DOTs in terms of looking at the Biden administration priorities on performance and asset management, on infrastructure resiliency and emergency relief, on carbon reduction, especially on EV charging infrastructure deployment, and broadband and other forms of technology deployment on the highway and transportation rights of way. And then, of course, advancing racial justice and incorporating equity, diversity, and inclusion in every aspect of transportation decision-making. We're looking to come up with a more concrete set of, policy recommendations to Congress actually next Monday as part of the AASHTO spring meeting, to inform Congress and the administration from the practitioner leadership perspective of our state DOT members. We've also floated the idea of, look, if we're going to go big and bold on funding on the highway and bridge side, let's look at the backlog that's been building up over the many decades going on at this point. Right now, we envision that we estimate about a $756 billion investment backlog, which is essentially, if this is the annual investment level and this is the needed investment level, and there's that gap, it's that gap being added on top of each other over a very long period of time. And when TRB looked at just the interstate highway system, they estimated 57 billion is needed every single year for 20 years. So absolutely huge numbers here, and also looking at commensurate increase on the transit and passenger rail side as part of the overall surface transportation picture. But, we do feel that if there is the appetite to go really bold, and look at, say, a $200 billion down payment as part of the infrastructure package on highways and bridges, followed by 2 5-year reauthorizations at substantial levels, admittedly, but, we think, possible levels, again, if there's the willpower to do it, then we can actually get rid of that $756 billion backlog that had loomed over, as you can see in this graphic, for a very long time, actually in the course of, say, next 10 years. And this is, just another data point that we wanted to put out there that also actually ties into the analytical kind of basis for calling for large federal infusion of funding. And it's something that, we've presented to Congress. And as you've seen, a lot of conversation obviously taking place between the administration and the Democrats and Republicans in both chambers of Congress as well. So what I'll do is let me stop the PowerPoint portion there and speak just briefly to kind of the lay of the land on the infrastructure conversation. I think there is still just a tremendous amount of uncertainty in whether the infrastructure package and how the 5-year surface reauthorization would interact. Would they be combined into one measure? Would they have to be done standalone? And so far, the path, continues to be where it is looking to be a standalone from the Democrats premised on the jobs plan, and then from the Republicans through their counteroffer that has the additional funding on top of reauthorization, as Margaret mentioned. So it's not quite apples to apples right now. And the legislative vehicle is also obviously very uncertain. But what is clear is that both the House T&I staff and the Senate EPW staff have been very hard at work to come up with the first draft of their respective reauthorization bills. And the goal, especially on the House side, is to get the markup process done at the committee level at T&I before Memorial Day, so later this month. The Senate is trying to do the same as well. The big question, I think there are a couple of them. One is the earmarks, how it would impact all of this being layered on top of the existing processes and the conversations and the uncertainty to it. It definitely adds more of that complexity. But certainly our state DOT members have been doing absolutely their best to provide members of Congress with technical assistance on project information that have to be part of the submissions, certainly at the House T&I process. And we do feel that they are taking the right steps in making sure that the projects come from the current TIPs and STIPs, that full funding has been secured already for the project. So it really gets away from some of the, I think, consequences of earmarking, 10 plus years ago at this point. We do still envision challenges in terms of whether we can see a bipartisan outcome through all of this. Obviously, you've heard about the conversations directly between the president and leaders of Congress. But we are very much aware of the fact that that could all fall apart and that it could be more of a partisan process. And we saw that through the House HR 2 bill last year, the Moving Forward Act that Margaret mentioned. And if that is the case, that I think then strengthens the momentum towards the reconciliation direction, and whether that is done just for the $2.1 trillion jobs plan or combines the American Families Plan and make this a even, I guess, larger package to be done in a partisan way. If that is the way things are going, then unfortunately, it would be hard to imagine appetite for Congress to come back to do the surface reauthorization by October 1. That's one possible path. But, for all the talk about infrastructure being, bipartisan consensus area, I haven't given up hope yet. And as long as the talks are continuing, that is better, I think, than what has transpired, in the recent years in the past. So I'll stop my remarks there because I really would love to hear questions and comments from the audience. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great. So again, please, everybody, please put your questions in the chat box. We want to hear from you, what you're interested in. I'm sure you all have questions because you're joining us today. So if it's about a project, if it's about funding, whatever you're interested in, please put those in the chat box. I wanted to ask at least one question before we jump into the other presentation, but it sounds like there are a number of new programs that are also being talked about with the American Jobs Plan, but even before that, with what the House and Senate put together in previous years. There were a lot of more attention to resiliency and climate and those kinds of things. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the new things that might be coming out? I know the American Jobs Plan also had a piece for accelerating projects or focusing on really big projects of regional significance. Are those things that AASHTO is supporting, and do you think that those will ultimately be part of this?
That's a really great question, Margaret. I mentioned the importance of the core formula programs from the state perspective because it really provides that flexibility across the board, right? Whether you're in Minnesota or Florida or Wyoming or California, we really continue to believe that that reflects, the already identified state and local priorities through the planning and programming process. That being said, there's always going to be, I think, kind of the new thematic kind of, emphasis every reauthorization bill cycle. We saw with MAP 21, it was program consolidation, where we arrived at the current core formula structure, NHPP, STP, STBGP, and the like, along with the introduction of national performance measures. In the FAST Act, the big theme was the freight programs, the National Highway Freight Program formula, and then what's become known as the Fast Lane, and then the infra discretionary grant programs. For this upcoming cycle, I think we are envisioning a lot more new elements. And as you kind of hit upon, whether it's resilience, greenhouse gas reduction, this idea of fix it right that the Biden administration has talked about, broadband deployment, EV charging infrastructure, bridge program, mega projects program, a lot of, I think, kind of the dollar focus on passenger rail and transit. Those were, I think, initially articulated in the House's HR2, that you see it reflected and updated, along with equity obviously being a huge across the board factor in the current conversation. For state DOTs, we feel that these priorities these are not, in conflict with the formula program, and that the formula program actually can, again, kind of customize those priorities that better fit into the individual state and local context. And like I said, we are looking to develop, I think, more specific policy recommendations and how to make it more executable from an actual, whatever the idea to actual, implementation through programs and projects and the like. But we are, concerned about doing kind of the implementation of new things or new goals through discretionary grant programs in particular, because what we see from infra and build over the years is that it takes just so much time and energy to put applications together. And you have about 5% chance of actually landing the grant. So that's extremely uncertain way of building your capital program around. It causes, I think, a lot of resource angst at USDOT as well. 8 person hours per application review is one estimate that I've heard over the years. And so there's only so much capacity to be able to process so much dollars and projects through the discretionary model relative to the formula. And so, we've talked to Congress about, look, some of the new eligibility, ideas, whether it's EV charging, resilience, et cetera, could be added to the existing core formula programs and be accomplished that way. But like I said, there's always going to be some new ideas and programs that Congress wants to be able to point back to as what they did. And we're certainly, trying to be as helpful in making it, again, implementable as it can be.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I know it's also challenging from the state perspective to figure out, do you have projects that fit those categories? And certainly here in Minnesota, we probably don't have the mega projects that on the East Coast or the West Coast, or they have in other parts of the country. So that's another issue. So we do have a couple questions. And Serge, you can feel free to jump in too. What can you tell us about proposed language for rural highway safety?
So I don't know which proposed language that the questioner might be referring to, but there is the high risk rural safety set aside as part of the highway safety improvement program in the past, where certain states that, are directed to put more money into that. There is a proposal from a senator from Louisiana that talks about carving out a set aside for every single state on high risk rural roads. And I think that's a great example of, well, right now, if state wants to focus on high risk rural roads, they can already do that without having to do it, whether you want to do it or not, right? So that speaks to, I think, having more flexibility for that particular core program category makes sense, rather than carving out this particular eligibility or requirement.
Great. And then there's a question about, this comes up a lot when there's a big influx of money. What does that do to bid prices? And do you think that that's going to be an issue going forward?
That's a great question. And, the graphic that I briefly showed as part of the PowerPoint of our very large funding idea, we've talked a lot about kind of the consumability question, right? Because if you don't do it right, where it's just so much money flooding the market, it just drives up the cost without, I think, providing kind of value or, return on investment that folks are looking for. So what we've put out in our proposal, we do think that in talking with our construction industry partners, doing it in a gradual but aggressive ramp up is a possible way to, minimize the cost escalation, the availability of the contractors to be able to do the work in, all parts of the country that we want the money to go to. So that is a very important question for consideration. And that is something that I think, if there really is the willpower or the kind of the consensus in Congress to come up with the large funding increase that we've been asking for so long that we haven't really seen, then yes, this absolutely, we can worry about it and really think through on this then. But part of me is, kind of being the skeptic that, after all this conversation, are we gonna, see a stalemate and then do another, program extension of the FAST Act, which is also, again, a very real possibility.
Yeah. And I know with the Biden administration, there's been a big emphasis on Buy America. Do we expect that that will be part of a final deal?
I think that's a really, good question in terms of, again, the policy intent. I don't think folks would, disagree with it, but how that impacts the real world situation and the conditions, I think that's something that needs further consideration or conversation on. By that, I mean something like EV charging infrastructure, right? The administration is calling for 500,000 charging stations. But a lot of the materials, I understand, are not available to be produced in short order within the US to meet Buy America requirements. And so those two goals, I think, especially given the administration's interest in getting those deployed as quickly as possible, there has to be some sort of an alignment in how both ideas can go forward. Because the way things are unfolding right now, we don't see a path where both can get done. And I think that's the kinds of questions that has to get addressed as part of the congressional process. The administration has come up with, right, a blueprint is what they're calling it. It's not the legislative text. It's not the end all be all. It's just a conversation starter to figure out how we can, turn those ideas again into practical kind of implementation.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to bring in Serge, but please, everybody, keep putting your questions in the chat and we will get to them. But I want to make sure we also hear from MnDOT's perspective, how they're sort of preparing for the potential. Seems a lot more optimistic than most years for some major federal funding. So I'm going to let Serge talk about how MnDOT is kind of preparing for all of this.
Thank you, Margaret. We have two really key partners on the call today, key partners for MnDOT. AASHTO and the policy arm of AASHTO, which is led by Joung, is a very important national organization for MnDOT, and our involvement in it is quite extensive. Nancy Daubenberger, Tim Sexton, Tim Hinkle are all leaders in their areas and spearhead our involvement in AASHTO. And in particular at this time of COVID, where we've not been to DC in a long time, AASHTO's presence there and sustained strategies to interact with both parties, with all leadership, with other organizations, with all states is crucial for the big picture. And Margaret, leading this is a very timely Zoom call because a lot is going on at the federal level. There are so many bills being discussed. Many of them are connected to resiliency and carbon emissions reduction, but they're also related to bike trails and a lot of other categories. So there's a lot of talk going on right now on the federal level, and there's a lot of interest in this group and all transportation groups in how it's going to fit together. The bottom line is the Biden administration has come in with a lot of new-ish ideas on transforming transportation funding and transportation objectives. At the same time, They are looking to consolidate traditional transportation objectives like pavement and bridges, making sure they're in good shape, and performance measures. So this Zoom call is a reflection of all that's going on, and I think will continue to go on in quite an intense manner, I think, until the summer recess, when there'll be a break. And then at that point, we'll sort of see what we have going into September, which of course is a key date this year because it's the end of the extension of the FAST Act. But it also seems like a lot of activity in this year is going to move towards resolution or punting, as I would call it, in the fall and in the winter. So when it comes to surface transportation reauthorization, the big thing right now, the way MnDOT is preparing, is we have just finished about a month's work of interaction with the congressional offices and with a lot of counties and cities on member-directed spending, which is the spending for the T&I committee, in which it's our understanding would be a component of surface transportation reauthorization. And an important facet of the earmarks discussion was that projects needed to be in the STIP. And projects that are in the STIP are fully funded. So that very fact is sort of, we're trying to get our heads around it. If the projects are already fully funded, what more additional money, what will that do? And how will we use it? But we talked with a number of the offices, and we still have to see which projects were selected or which will be approved, because at this point, the member offices I've seen a number of lists. They've put out their projects that they've submitted, and it's a matter of which ones will be approved by the committee. And I'm not 100% sure how that works, but the lists aren't final. So we need to see which projects made the cut, and then we'll have to see how much of the 20% match MnDOT will have to follow. I mean, again, that doesn't seem to add up. If there are projects in the STIP and they need the match already identified, but somehow we have this concern that a certain amount of the projects won't have the 20%, and that MnDOT will need to cover that. So that would add to our existing needs. As of right now, I have to say, I don't know of too many projects. There's just two I can think of the ones that I've seen, but I haven't seen all the lists of the final projects. I mean, even going into the approval process. So it doesn't, I'm not saying we're super nervous about it. But at the same time, we want to see those final lists to see what additional funding needs will be placed on MnDOT. And the additional ones are we are facing a bridge bubble, which is common to all the states in the country. For Minnesota, that means we've got over 400 bridges that are not even in the 10-year plan. And they amount to over $2 billion in unmet needs. The Blotnick Bridge is the focal point, probably the biggest bridge in terms of cost. And that one it'll be in the next STIP. It's being discussed now for being added to the STIP. But you see, part of the issue was we couldn't even work with the offices on an earmark for Blotnick because it's not in the 10-year plan even. But that bridge bubble is, if we got money from a stimulus plan or a big influx in surface transportation or a combination of both, we would look at those two areas in terms of our strategies. You know, as we've heard, there's a lot of talk of new programs, but we still have a lot of unmet needs for pavement and bridges. I mentioned the bridges. Pavement is even more spread out, and we're trying to manage that across the whole state. So in the area of greenhouse gas reduction and mitigation, Minnesota is working on, first off, we have our main vehicle for long form public engagement is the STAC, Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council. And that's the primary executive branch tool for moving the state to a low carbon transportation future. And they've come out with 3 recommendations. 1, develop a clean fuels policy. 2, establish rebates for EVs, including dealership support, as well as rebates for on-site purchases. And then 3, increase investment in EV charging infrastructure. And particularly that second and third one, there are some state things being discussed, but of course, the Biden American Jobs Plan has a lot of money for rebates. It would come out to $160 billion. It was actually a larger amount in funding than the amount for highways and bridges, because the goal was to provide about a $5,000 point of sale rebate when buying electric cars, electric vehicles, I should say. So that emphasis would help out a lot, obviously. And then for the EV charging infrastructure, that's something we are exploring in adding to projects, adding installation of EV charging stations as we look at project plans right now. But again, all this would be facilitated to nth degree if there was federal legislation like provisions in the authorization bill or provisions in provisions and money in a stimulus plan. Like I mentioned before, though, I want to emphasize for all this talk of climate change resiliency and electrification, I think the Biden administration is also well aware of the traditional need for pavement and bridges, keeping our infrastructure maintained. And so there's been a consistent voice led by AASHTO, and MnDOT is a big part of that voice, that would not lower the formula core highway and bridge programs funding. Any new money would be on top of it, not taken out of it. And we really like the appointee, the deputy administrator, Pollock. She was a former commissioner of Massachusetts DOT, and we've had a couple meetings with her, and she has definitely communicated that FHWA is going to focus on performance metrics. And so, one of the questions that we are going to talk about in the AASHTO meeting next week. AASHTO has a big spring meeting. It's one of the 3 biggest meetings for AASHTO, and there will be a policy group talking about the main policy questions at the moment. And on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, the big question is carbon reduction going to be tied to performance measures? And performance measures at the federal level would include state, local, government, land use agencies, as well as federal standards. And one of the things that it looks like is gonna be a way to narrow down the discussion is, will the potential greenhouse gas reduction measures be CO2 emissions generated by on-road mobile sources, or per capita CO2 emissions generated by on-road mobile sources? The first one is more of a simple, straightforward measure that can be calculated. The other one is more complex because it includes interaction of population growth or decline for a geographic region. And I should say the other climate change, when it comes to resiliency, big question is, would that funding and reauthorization come as formula funding? And if so, if it was formula, would it expand a core program's eligibilities or create a totally new resiliency for a program? Or would the resiliency funding come in the form of competitive grants, which would probably emphasize incorporating resilience into planning, design, and operations? Those are some of the things we're going to discuss. These are some of many next week at the AASHTO meeting. And MnDOT is actually a pretty big voice in the country in talking about these and trying to change the culture, you know, the internal combustion engine, using fossil fuels as the primary energy source and primary mode of transportation in our state. And we've had good discussions with the Biden administration, and we're comfortable with the level of participation both there and with AASHTO. And that's how we're preparing for what hopes to be a really big transformational year. There's a lot of optimism that transportation will be one of the key topics for this year. But as we all know, there has to be progress with the legislation or the stimulus bill. If it stalls out, experience tells us that Congress will turn to something else. And while the presidency is, Biden is a Democrat, and Congress, the House and Senate both have Democrat majorities, they are slim majorities. And the word I'm hearing, maybe Joung can chime in, but what I'm hearing from our offices is only talk of reconciliation, which is a Democrat-led approach. And I think if that happens, that carries a lot of risk. I think if the proposals were more bipartisan, I would feel better about their chances of success. But reconciliation is a method that the Democrats have identified as a potential path towards getting these transformational transportation provisions passed in a surface transportation bill and a stimulus bill. So that is that's the Minnesota perspective at this time.
Great, thank you. That was a lot of really good information. So we do have some questions. I want to jump in on the issue of electric cars, because there's a question about that as well. You know, there's a lot about that going on. Of course, there's a big push for more electrification and electric vehicles. It was interesting after the Biden administration proposed increasing corporate tax rates to pay for infrastructure, that we heard more from Republicans about user fees and maybe a fee on electric vehicles. It does seem that a vehicle miles traveled tax is a ways off for a lot of reasons. But so most states, and a lot of states have this now, have an annual electric vehicle fee, including Minnesota with a $75 annual fee. Do you see that kind of approach at the federal level as we struggle with, you know, trying to get money towards paying for these things? But I think politically, kind of the upside is that it does seem to be the one tax that Republicans embrace. You know, there's just a lot of question about how to pay for all of this. And with the president sort of putting a hard line in the sand about not taxing people who don't make more than $400,000 a year, we almost have a flip-flop when it comes to who's supporting user fees and who's not. You know, it used to be the Democrats supported the user fee increases and Republicans didn't. Now at the federal level, it kind of feels like things have switched. And so now the Democrats don't want to raise the gas tax or user fees because that hits everybody. And Republicans don't want to hit corporations and people who are wealthy. So do you see an electric vehicle fee as maybe a place where they could potentially come to some kind of agreement, given the cost of electric vehicles? You're not going to see a lot of low-income people buying, you know, brand new electric vehicles. So just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. You're absolutely right, Margaret. I mean, I think it really is interesting to see how the political stance regarding the infrastructure investment is playing out, because for the longest time, as you mentioned, you know, I mean, the biggest obstacle was how to pay for it all. Yes, we all agree infrastructure is important, but how do we pay for it all? And then, you know, it has quickly morphed into, well, what exactly constitutes infrastructure? And, well, how much do we actually, you know, put it on the credit card or some other non-user fee-based means like the corporate tax? Or do we go back to the tried and true user fee framework? The gas tax still seems to be, you know, off the table for enough of the congressional leaders. And this conversation about VMT, you know, it's not new, right? We all have talked about it now for more than a decade. We've had the two commissions from Safety Lou that directed, how do we fix the trust fund? Do a short-term gas tax increase, move to the VMT fee. But there is, I think, as you mentioned, Margaret, the desire to look more at the national VMT implementation framework, especially coming from folks like Sam Graves, the ranking member for T&I committee, Senator John Cornyn from Texas, one of the leadership in the Republican caucus there. So we are looking to kind of harness that interest, right? Because we haven't heard that as much before, especially from the Republicans. And really, okay, let's talk about it. We can't get it done by October 1, obviously. But is there, you know, some really good base we can build very quickly based on the experience of state DOTs that have already done this, like Utah, like Oregon, that have, you know, not just a pilot program, but an actual implemented program. You have states like Washington and California that have done pilot program, and others as well. The East Coast, there's a whole up and down corridor along I-95 that are looking at it. So we do think that there's a lot of practical experience at the state level. We do think that it's been helpful to see that seed money in the FAST Act for surface transportation funding alternatives that have funded a lot of these state activities. And it only makes sense to then look at bringing all this together in terms of interstate operability, thorny questions on like how the revenues are collected and then distributed, right, in terms of the formula process, all those considerations. We do think that it makes sense to talk about it, but we also recognize that you can't turn the switch on that in the next few years. So, you know, to the effect that you talk about the, you know, one-time EV charging or once a year EV charging fee, that's something, as you mentioned, also works well at the state level. But I think, you know, we've been very careful to not let the federal revenue, I guess, scope kind of creep into the traditional state responsibilities pertaining to licensing, registration, vehicle fees, and the like, right? If the feds get into that for beyond commercial / truck vehicles, then that's a whole different conversation as well.
Yeah, and I don't know, Serge, if you want to get into this too, but I think it's really encouraging that MnDOT is promoting a rebate or a tax credit, because, you know, those are the kinds of things that really help push people and help them in their decision making. Because if you're talking about $5,000 or what used to be at the federal level $7,500, and then sometimes people have been able to combine that with another state tax credit, You know, that makes a huge difference as people are considering whether or not to buy an electric vehicle. A $75 fee or even a $150 fee isn't going to change anybody's mind. So it's a little frustrating when people say, well, we shouldn't have an electric vehicle fee because they'll discourage people from buying an electric car. It's hard to imagine that that price level, it really makes a difference. But these incentives and these tax credits make a huge difference. So I'm wondering if you, because I haven't seen anything in Minnesota this year, but do you think that that might happen in Minnesota, that we would have a state credit for electric vehicles?
Well, Margaret, it's a challenge was set out by Senate Republicans in Minnesota. Jung, our legislature is divided. Our pollution control agency is doing a rulemaking called Clean Cars. And as part of that, that's, you know, adopting low emissions vehicle and zero emission vehicle and emission pollution standards. But it also would require vehicle manufacturers to deliver EVs to the Minnesota market. And the reaction to that was pretty tough. The Senate Republicans said that they would not approve funding for the agency, and even talked about shutting down state parks. So, you know, in some of these ways, PCA is sort of taking the lead, or pollution control for transportation. But boy, they were encountering a lot of resistance on the Republican end. So we'll have to see how that works going forward. But I think Jung alluded to that. I think all these things are rebates or standards, you know, outside of the federal, you know, umbrella. These are good things for states to keep under their control. You know, a national federal rebate program, I think would have to work with states to ideally work. But for that challenge, I mean, our governor and MnDOT are committed to this transformational shift to new energy sources. So we just extend a lot of sympathy to our pollution control administration colleagues, because they are under the gun right now.
Yes, that's true. So we also have a question about local road projects. Obviously, there's a huge need on the local system. And there's always seems to be a tension at the national level about, should federal money focus on things that have more national significance? But how do you see things shaping up in terms of additional funding that would either be directly for locals or maybe help free up more money to direct to the local system?
Sorry, I was also like typing some of the answers through the Q&A box there. But, you know, we really value at the state level the partnership with, you know, the localities and the MPOs. I think, you know, we've seen a really great, you know, success over the years, especially since AASHTO, in terms of really developing and harnessing the metropolitan planning process. And also, you know, states are very much interested in making sure every federal dollar gets used as efficiently and quickly possible, right, to deliver on local priorities, especially as part of the suballocated SDVGP process. Some states have instituted, you know, the fund swaps, where state dollars are substituted for the suballocated dollars to be able to, you know, process those dollars more quickly. Again, all those things are being done with the goal of achieving local priorities faster than it would otherwise be possible. There are also the LTAP programs in every state that seek to increase institutional capability at the localities, especially smaller localities that may not have the, you know, just the staffing or resources to put up with federal requirements. So all those things that we think, you know, definitely should continue to be strengthened. The idea of direct local funding from the federal government, you know, if the local entity again has the capability to do so, we don't see why that shouldn't happen. It's just that I think the proper expectations should be made in that without building, I think, more of that institutional capacity, you can't just provide more dollars and expect that it's going to just get spent out. Because I do think that in that scenario, nobody looks good. The feds don't look good. The states don't look good. The locals won't look good. So that's something that we're continuing to have a lot of conversations with our folks, our friends on the Hill on.
Right. And Serge, do you see a scenario where maybe there's a lot more federal money for MnDOT, that MnDOT would maybe have more resources to help locals with their projects, and maybe put more money into some of these projects and maybe reduce the local cost participation or provide more resources to specific local programs?
Short answer is yes. I think any additional funding we get, I mean, the recent experience, so I have to think it'll continue moving forward, is that a lot of that money will be invested in local projects because that's a significant number of the unmet needs. And whether that's, delineated by rural versus urban or local versus state or federal roads, it certainly comes out to half or more of the projects, of the funding. I mean, just for an example, this earmarks process, my observation, again, it's incomplete, but to this point, my observation is the great majority of projects were local projects selected. In the grant programs, like RAISE now it's called, many of those projects were local. And we started out thinking that those would be for sort of mega projects or something. But as it turns out, it seems like a certain amount was carved out for local projects. So I would see that moving forward. Frankly, that addresses the question someone had about rural road safety. I mean, safety on rural roads is a big priority for MnDOT. That's an area we're trying to improve in, going back to the performance measures. I see a couple questions? Can I try and get at those? So Cindy Gray had a question on additional funding for planning. I think not all the details are worked out when you see proposals for American Jobs Plan, but just simply based on the references, the frequent references to the emphasis on planning and design in developing projects with better equity considerations, with more climate change resilience, I feel like it's inevitable that there will be more planning dollars as part of those new programs, because that's one of the places that those types of policy considerations will have to start. So I do see that. And then replacing the gas tax income for roads with the push for electric cars.
I think we kind of got into that one, but there is a good question that I think, because we don't have a lot of time left, would be helpful for people. Is it does get confusing with the earmarks between the appropriations and the authorization. So maybe if you could help explain what T&I is looking for in terms of earmarks as part of the authorization, and then what individual members are looking for in terms of earmarks for the appropriations. And is there a formal process, or is it kind of each member decides for themselves what, if they're gonna, I know the US Senate has been trying to struggle with this a little bit, and we heard from Tina Smith's office that they're going to have a form on their website that people can use to apply for earmarks. So how do you see the process going for this?
Well, they're different for different offices, and when they identify a form, the bottom line is you have to fill it out. They are not taking projects if you don't fill out the form and completely. With earmarks, again, there's different criteria, but I'd say the difference between the T and I are there's a number. They get to choose up to 10 projects, but there's no dollar amount. So for example, of course, Alaska member Young came in at the top. His 10 projects came out to over $100 million. Whereas I've seen some members lists that are under 10 million and maybe even some. I thought I heard somewhere that North Dakota, that a member said, we're not going to submit any. I haven't verified that, but maybe Cindy can chime in if she knows about that. Cindy Gray. And on the appropriations side, it's a dollar amount. It's 15 to 20 million and not a certain number of projects. And also those projects are not just for transportation. They include any of the policy areas. So I would say that's the big difference between them. The other big difference is appropriations could potentially be year after year because they're tied to appropriations, whereas the T&I one seems tied to reauthorization, because outside of reauthorization, really don't see where they get involved in funding. You know, it's pretty clearly out defined, which is for the authorizing committee and which is for appropriations committee.
Yeah, there's also a question, sorry for the jargon, but T&I is Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House. That's what the committee is called, and people just call T&I as kind of a shortcut. But I want to thank everybody, and thank you very much. Joung Lee, Serge, Phillips, thank you so much for all the great information. We hope to stay in communication and stay updated, and certainly keep up with all the requests from Minnesota and what we can do as we get closer to hopefully the committees making a decision. We'll certainly be in touch with our congressional members and hope that there can be a bill by Memorial Day. That would be great. So again, thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
Thank you, everyone. Good to have everybody involved. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.